Well, we're here literally 3 days after the momentous vote on the Asylum and Migration Pact, which was on Wednesday night. We finally went through at 79 to 72, which is very, very tight. And so this is more like a whodunit look back on the events that unfolded. But what is extraordinary about today, which is Saturday morning after the vote, is that there hasn't been one single columnist cover what has been an absolutely momentous decision by the Oireachtas during the week. And I just find that quite extraordinary. It's the same again this weekend. Not a single columnist in any of the broadsheets have covered it at all. In fact, the last few days have been filled with many other stories, none of them as significant or anywhere could be regarded as being remotely near the relevance of what happened to us all on Wednesday night. And with me to discuss what has occurred and get into some of the detail on who voted, why they might have voted, and what are the next steps. I'm delighted to interview Tracey O'Mahoney, barrister Tracey O'Mahoney. So Tracey, you know, you've been in the wars really around all of this kind of stuff since the very early stages in Q1 2020. I know that because we've met a few times, and you've been unerringly accurate in many of your legal analysis, which you've done many times on video casts. So I'm very interested to hear your take on, firstly, on the next just if we could start maybe, Tracey, with the legal side. So this decision has now been made by the Oireachtas, but then it has to be notified to the President of the EU Parliament, I think, and that's a process that's going to take a bit of time. Is there anything at all legally? Is there any instrument at all? Because there's a lot of confusion out there. I want to kind of clear that up. That can be done at this stage.
So first of all, I think we're aware that there has been potentially 2 legal actions that have been taken by separate plaintiffs, Michelle Keane and Una McGurk. So they both took injunctions to try and stop the government from, number 1, I believe, holding the vote, and number 2, from opting into the EU Migration Pact, as you say, whereby they have to notify the European Parliament or the European Council that they intend to opt in. As I understand it, Michelle Keane's legal case has been unsuccessful, but as I understand it, Una McGurk's case is still ongoing. So there is still a potential that Una may be able to secure an injunction that would stop the government from opting in. The first point that I would note is, and
even though the vote has gone through?
Even though the vote has gone through. Well, to be honest with you, in my opinion, I didn't think that it was ever going to be possible to stop the vote happening, because obviously in this country, under the Constitution, we have the separation of powers, which is meant to be a checks and balances between the different organs of the state, that each can't interfere in the other. So what that would mean is that the judiciary couldn't interfere with the role of the Oireachtas, or the legislator or the executive, in relation to policy matters, or in relation to the likes of the vote, the EU Migration Pact vote. So I didn't think it was ever going to be possible to stop that vote taking place, because that's a decision of the Oireachtas to hold that vote. So I would always have thought that if somebody was seeking an injunction, it would have to be after the vote had taken place, but before we actually opted into the Pact. Because once we opt into the Pact, there's a potential that under the Constitution, as part of the Lisbon referendum, this clause that we agreed to, the necessitated obligations clause, would be triggered, which says that EU law is supreme over Irish law in certain limited circumstances. So my fear would be that once the government formally opt in to the EU Migration Pact, it may not be possible after that to stop it from happening.
But the formality of that requires the government now to notify the EU that we're going to opt in. But what's the time gap between now and then? Do you have any idea?
The only information I have on that is just a comment that Helen McEntee, where she said that it would take a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But at the same time, I'm not sure how much credence we should give to that statement, because at one point we thought the vote was happening today, then we thought it was happening tomorrow, then we thought it was happening at 11 o'clock at night, and then it ends up happening at 8:30. So I think an awful lot of the time they might say certain things and we will hang on those statements, and then something else happens that actually, makes something that we're trying to do redundant. So she has commented that it would take a couple of weeks, but there's no firm commitment that that's actually correct.
Well, on Tuesday night, I did a series of interviews, but one in particular with Matty McGrath, and I asked Matty about the manoeuvrings that were going on around all of this business, and it's a very, very interesting discussion. That's up separately on YouTube, and you can have a look at that. And we get into how the state is actually organised after 10 minutes in that discussion, what I call the deep state. They're my words. And it's a fascinating insight from the trenches in the Dáil and his response to the questions that I gave to him. So now we're going to go and we're going to have a look at the actual vote, the moment of the vote in the Dáil on Wednesday night, quite late.
Neil 73, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed. Yes. Yes.
This motion has such serious consequences for Irish people, and the gap is only 6 votes. I'm asking for a vote other than electronic means.
Well, since the gap is less than 10 and a vote has been demanded by a teller, we'll proceed with a vote. But please, we'll proceed with a vote, a roll call vote.
So, Tracey, obviously, it's very, very unsatisfactory, the manoeuvring around, the getting it through, trying to guillotine it. As soon as the election was over, it was suddenly back on the agenda. It was pulled before the election, and then the whip system came in, and there was a very tight yes vote by only a margin of 7. So let's have a look at at those that voted for this pact.
Sure. So, as you said, there were 79 votes in favour and 72 votes against. So there was a margin, as you said, of 7. 151 TDs showed up to vote and 9 TDs weren't present. So in terms of the yes votes, what happened was every Green Party TD showed up and voted yes. Every Fianna Fáil TD, bar 2, showed up and voted yes. And every Fine Gael TD, bar 2, showed up and voted yes. So this very much was a government manoeuvred vote, and that's what actually propelled it through. So just in relation to the no votes, so as we said, there were 72 people who voted no. So that was the different parties that voted no. Number 1 was Aon 2. Obviously, Peadar Tóibín is the only TD that we have in Aon 2. We had 18 independent TDs. So my understanding is that every independent TD voted against it.
But can I pause you there? Isn't that very significant that all independent TDs voted no because they were plugged into what the people felt on the ground?
Absolutely.
Whereas the political parties were following the whip system and basically taking their orders from above.
Absolutely. And even if you see a number of the different laws that the government has been passing over the last number of years that have been somewhat controversial, even for some of those laws, a good number of the independent TDs or so-called independent TDs did vote with the government. So I do think it is very significant that no independent TD voted in favour of this pact. Definitely is.
Very significant. I'm going to ask what might be a silly question, but and I probably know the answer to it, but a lot of people might think this. Why wasn't there a free vote given for such an extraordinary decision to be made by the nation?
When you say a free vote, do you mean
no whips?
No whips. Well, because the government had told the EU that they were going to ensure that this pact was passed, and it's as simple as that, it was going to pass. So they were never going to give a free vote to TDs on it, ever.
And there was also some missing people, most unusually missing.
Sure.
The leader of Sinn Féin, absent.
Well, so as I said, Aon 2 voted no, 18 independent TDs voted no. Sinn Féin, they have 37 TDs in the Dáil, 36 attended and voted no. Mary Lou was nowhere to be seen, which I would say for the leader of a party, if you're against such a significant transfer of sovereignty for a party that's meant to be Republican in nature, for the leader of that party not to turn up is significant, I would say. And I think an awful lot of people haven't actually been pointing out the fact that Mary Lou McDonald did not attend that vote, so that is significant. Then in relation to the Social Democrats, I think the Social Democrats have 6 TDs, so 5 showed up and voted no, and the only one who didn't was Jennifer Whitmore. And then in relation to Labour, I believe Labour have 7 TDs, 5 showed up and 2 didn't. Aidan O'Riordan, who has been appointed an MEP but who hasn't taken up his seat yet, so he was entitled to vote, and the other one was Duncan Smith. And then I believe the only other person who didn't turn up was Joan Collins, who's a TD with Independents for Change. So all in all, even if we had the TDs, so there was obviously 4 TDs from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil who could have voted with the party, and then there were 5 other TDs who potentially could have voted no. So obviously if we add those 5 number TDs to the 72 who did vote no, we would still only have been at 77, and the government were at 79. So unless some people within the government either voted against the government or didn't turn up, it still wouldn't have gone our way. So it was the government who propelled this through at the end of the day.
But what I find, and I know it's how our system operates. I don't call it democracy operating properly, but nevertheless, it is how it's done at the moment. But I find it quite extraordinary that all 18 independent TDs, clearly listening to the grassroots, voted no, along with some other smaller parties. I get that, but to me that's very, very significant, and that all of the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and Green TDs went along with the whip, which means that they were clearly not listening or decided not to act in the interests of their own constituents, because it was an overwhelming feeling out there that we were all picking up, including the independents, so it was real, to say, no, we don't want to opt into this because we have voted about this previously in Lisbon, and we retained the right, and people were aware that the Danes weren't doing so either. So I just found it a very, very sad night to see all this play out. I think it's going to have ramifications in the up and coming general election. What do you think?
I hope it has ramifications. I think an awful lot of people say that the local election isn't a reflection on how people will vote in the general election, and I certainly hope that is the case. I hope that the electorate look at what the government did here and they realise that the people that they are electing in their local constituencies to represent them are not representing them. I really hope they recognise that, and when the general election comes up, and a lot of us are hearing that it's going to be in October of this year, that they actually vote to make sure they vote these people out and vote in people who do have the interests of the Irish people at the forefront.
Now, I just wanted to, just on that particular point, I just wanted to touch briefly on the 1922 Constitution, Article 48, which allowed the people to take part in people's referendums. To initiate. And therefore it was the closest to what I would describe as the Swiss model at the moment. And that was then repealed. Sorry, it just didn't appear in the 1937 version of the Constitution.
Well, I'm not sure if you actually understand, and obviously not being condescending or anything, I'm not sure if you understand how it happened. So the 1922 Constitution under Article 48 said that the government should legislate within, I think it was 2 or 3 years of that Constitution coming into effect, they should legislate for direct democracy, whereby the people could initiate a referendum. And if they didn't legislate for it, the default was that if 75% of the electorate petitioned the government, that they would have to hold a referendum on a particular issue. So that was 1922, and that constitution was obviously passed. That was the constitution of the Irish Free State. By 1924, the government were saying, hang on a second, this idea of direct democracy, not sure that we really like this idea. And by 1924, a subcommittee was suggesting that the law should be repealed, that it actually should be deleted out of the Constitution. And by 1928, it actually was deleted out of the Constitution. So what the government had done when they introduced the 1922 Constitution was they had another article in it that said that if there were latent defects in the Constitution, they had a period of 8 years to rectify those defects. And most people thought those defects were like drafting errors. But what the government said to themselves was, this clause is so widely worded that we can actually change anything we want in the Constitution. So they actually legislated in 1928 to remove the direct democracy
control of the people.
Control of the people, to take it out of the Constitution. So that happened in 1928. Okay. And to add insult to injury, in 1930 they actually said to themselves, okay, we like this ability to be able to amend the Constitution without having to go to the people. So what we're going to actually do is, by virtue of that clause where we can amend the Constitution, we're going to increase this window where we can amend it for 8 years, for another 8 years. So they actually increased the ability to amend the Constitution without going to the people for a period of 16 years. And then we obviously know in 1937 the 1937 Constitution was brought in, and there was nothing in the 1937 Constitution about direct democracy. And also the 1937 Constitution introduced the concept of the common good. So I think there was an awful lot of review of the Constitution and what works well and what doesn't work well. And by the time they got to the 1937 Constitution, they had it very well ironed out to make sure that they had, and these aren't my words, these are the words of some TDs in 1937 when they were actually debating the Constitution. They said that there was a dictatorial level of authority given to the government through the Constitution. And another thing is what I suppose is, in addition to introducing the common good, which we know obviously means that the rights of the collective supersede the rights of the individual, and it was on the basis of the common good that they introduced an awful lot of laws, say around COVID, even around things like the property charges, things like that have gone through the courts to determine whether or not they are constitutional. And the courts have said because of the common good, they are constitutional, because we can take money off this person to give it to this person for the common good. But there are also an awful lot of other limitations and restrictions in the Constitution. So even if you're talking about the likes of hate speech or protest exclusion zones, an awful lot of the fundamental rights in the Constitution, they're subject to public order and morality. So there's an awful lot of subject to the common good, they're subject to public order and morality. So an awful lot of the rights in the Constitution, they're not absolute, where people think they are. So I think an awful lot of people look at the Constitution and they say, well, I have this blue book, and this blue book gives me rights and freedoms. The first thing that I would say is that no politician writing down on a piece of paper gives anybody rights and freedoms. People have natural rights by virtue of being alive. The Constitution may protect some rights, and that's one thing I think that we want to hammer home to people. But second of all, the Constitution, in my view, is an illusion of freedom, because there is so much restriction in the Constitution. So I think they very much got it right when they were looking at 1922 and 1928, 1930, 1937. They were saying what works well here and what doesn't work well here, and how do we maintain control. And by the time they got to the 1937 Constitution, they had figured it out.
But if a provision like that existed, and say it wasn't taken, it wasn't diluted and then just forgotten about, in a situation like that, I mean, the bank bailout, the implementation of vaccine passports, all of that might have never even been tabled if the people had the capacity to bypass the National Chamber and say, no, we actually want a national vote about this.
Absolutely, and that's the reason they couldn't allow it to remain in there, because they don't want the people to have that power. They want them to have the illusion of freedom while the government retains the power. So therefore, we're beginning to see momentum behind political parties, smaller political parties forming because of this gap in to the right of the centre. Let's just call it that, and that's going to come up in the general election. Isn't there a possibility there that if they get it right, if that were to become a common policy position, we actually want to empower the Irish people again. We want to go back in principle to what happened in 1922 and implement it, because we never again want to see the National Chamber manoeuvred in the way that it was manoeuvred this week. And it wouldn't be the first time, but in this particular case, it was about handing over control of the borders to the banal bureaucrats in Brussels. Mm-hmm. Definitely, I think if that was a policy position, and I do know obviously the party Direct Democracy Ireland, that was obviously their main policy position, as I understand it, was to bring back direct democracy to the people. I think there are potentially, well, obviously there are no political parties at the moment that are advocating for that type of...
Well, they certainly wouldn't. It would be like the turkeys voting for Christmas, wouldn't it? Especially for those, the incumbent, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and of course the Greens, the rump of the Greens, to form a coalition, are certainly not going to agree to something like that.
Because, as you said, they're not actually representing the people. They're doing, I think, an awful lot of our laws now obviously are created, drafted, implemented, signed off in Europe. Sometimes I wonder what we're actually paying our politicians for. And I believe between their salary, their allowances and their expenses, they're on maybe about 170,000 a year. So once we increase the Dáil seats from 160 to 174 in the next general election, the TDs are costing us, just for that alone, not even including their pensions and whatever other committees they might be on, they're costing us about 30 million a year. And if they're actually outsourcing their legislative function to the EU, what are we paying them for?
It's a very good question, but I was just to focus on the differentiator. So if the National Chamber wants to hold on to all these, what I call pretty arcane manoeuvres about how the Dáil operates, and would see a significant threat to their power and privilege and position if the people themselves can organise their own their own votes on key issues, like, for example, the Immigration and Migration Pact, and other things like the bank bailout, and all of these major decisions that are simply made through the party whip system. That would be a big differentiator, wouldn't it, between the fledgling parties coming through and the existing political parties, because they would be completely alienated from one another on a crystal clear point.
It definitely would, but I think one of the issues that you would have is the type of parties that would be willing to propose that type of an initiative are probably the type of parties that couldn't actually get access to the mainstream media. So the public at large wouldn't even know that this was one of their policy positions, because the media, who I believe at this point are nearly controlled by the government, the media wouldn't let that information get out into the public because they want to maintain, obviously, control with the government parties as it stands at the minute. So that is, the fact that we don't have an independent, well-financed media is a significant issue in trying to break through to the middle Ireland.
But there is a bigger issue there, of course, in that the leadership, the medical leadership, the press leadership, the government leadership are the same leadership that pulled us through the 3 years of COVID and all of the stuff that went on there. So I really don't see them softening their position, because they're protecting themselves, especially now from the significant level of data that's coming in globally about the impact of all of this on public health everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you see that playing out then? I know it's a political question, but I'd be curious to see what you think. How do you see that playing out in the up-and-coming general election? I mean, the carryover from the refusal of the people to go with the commentariat and the political establishment in the constitutional referendum, which was very, very significant, and then the big growth, the big swing towards not voting for any particular party in the independent swing in the locals. How do you see that moving forward? Because you were just saying there quite correctly that the media are very much pro the establishment position, and clearly they're not covering the momentous events this week today in the national newspapers, and I don't expect they'll be covered tomorrow in the Sunday newspapers, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think it through. So how do you think it might play out then at the general election?
I think an awful lot of people say, and I would agree, that the local election isn't an indicator of how the general election will go. An awful lot of people, and I know from hearing people on the ground, an awful lot of people were saying, well, I voted for this guy because he came to my father's funeral, or I voted for this guy because he got traffic lights down the end of the road. So it's very much, local community. So it's not necessarily an indicator of how things are going to go in the general election. I also think that the 8th of March referendums on the family and the home, I don't necessarily know that those referendums were a win for, the centre-right. I think there were an awful lot of people came out that Middle Ireland would consider to be respectable, and then that made it okay for them to hold the same opinion as those people. Whereas an awful lot of people, when they're talking about the likes of, say, the immigration issue, they'll kind of whisper it. They still kind of think there's something wrong with saying that we should have a cap on the number of people that we bring into this country, because we only have a finite number of resources, or limited resources in the country, and that those resources should primarily be devoted to the people of this country, the people who pay the taxes, the people who have actually built this country up over years. So I think there is still a cohort of people that will kind of whisper that, so they still don't feel like, even though they might go and have it, in an independent poll or a confidential poll, they might say, this is my view on immigration, but they're still not going to go down, and talk quite openly about it. But you would hope that once they go to the ballot box, they will vote in accordance with their view on it. I think one of the problems that we do have is that the people who are, say, the centre-right, those parties, they don't get, as I said, an awful lot of media coverage. So an awful lot of people don't even know who these people are. Like, I know I've spoken to a good lot of people who, before the local elections, I was saying to them, how are you voting? And they were saying, well, I'm not happy voting for the government because I don't agree with them on this and this and this. And I said, well, who are you voting in the alternative? And they said, well, I don't know that I have anybody to vote for. And then I mentioned a couple of, the parties that I might consider that I would have voted for, and they said, I've never heard of them. And the reason they've never heard of them is because they can't get onto the mainstream media. So even if the people who would maybe agree with some of our views, even if those people wanted to vote for parties, I don't think a lot of the time they even know who to vote for. And as well as that, I think there's somewhat of a fracture between the number of parties that are out there. And an awful lot of people are calling for some level of unity between the parties, so there isn't a split in the vote and that there aren't too many people running. But I certainly think that if it was possible to get some kind of a level of cooperation between those parties, there is a potential that we could get people elected. And I think that's something that those groups, I would hope personally, would be focused on for the next general election.
I'm sure they will, but there's been a lot of confusion. I know it seems like the week went on forever. I mean, it was only a few days ago that this happened, and just 3 days ago I was in my underground studio in Buswell's Hotel across the road from the action. So trying to interviewing a very interesting group of people. All that's up online, but I just wanted to just ask you about the confusion. Some people seem to think that there is a role here for the President of Ireland, to refer all this to the Supreme Court, but there's not. Sure, there's not.
No, there isn't. So I believe that's Article 26 of the Constitution, which refers to the ability of the President in certain limited circumstances to refer bills to the Supreme Court to test their constitutionality. But what people aren't recognising is that this is not a bill. This was a motion with a vote. It's not a bill. It's not a piece of legislation. So it hasn't gone through, even though it has gone through the Dáil and the Seanad, it's not a piece of law. So it's just a motion with a vote, and his ability to refer bills to the Supreme Court is limited to bills, proposed pieces of law. So I don't believe there's an avenue there for the President to actually do that.
So if we take that answer and we go back to the legal action that's still underway, we believe in the High Court, which is the Una McGurk case, and we know that there may be a couple of weeks between now and the notification to the EU. Once it goes into the EU, it becomes part of EU law, and it's outside of the jurisdiction. Or
potentially.
Let's say that happens, and it goes, and it gets it. The process continues, and it's uninterrupted. Where does that leave us then in terms of what kind of difficulty are we then in?
Well, firstly, in relation to Una's case or anybody else that will be taking a case after the vote has happened and before we formally opt in, presumably that would be an injunction to stop them opting in. And I would presume the argument that people would be making, because I'm not involved in any of the legal case that anybody is taking, I presume the argument they would be making is that on the basis of the 1987 Crotty versus An Taoiseach case, that what the government are doing is an unauthorised delegation of authority, whereby they're transferring the sovereignty of the Irish people over to Brussels. My difficulty with that argument is, and I hope I'm wrong, and I'm not a constitutional law expert, but my understanding would be that potentially isn't unconstitutional, because we have held no less than 3 referendums whereby the Irish people have agreed to cede authority to the government in the areas of freedom, security and justice, which includes immigration and asylum. First, by virtue of the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997-98, second of all by virtue of the Treaty of Nice in 2002-2003, and third of all by virtue of the Treaty of Lisbon. In 2008-2009. So my concern is that we have already ceded authority to the government to opt in or not to these laws. And the problem is, when you're going into the court, what you're saying to the court is that it's an unauthorised delegation of authority. I think we've already given that authority to the government. So that's the first issue. But the one thing that I would like to say is that even if Una McGurk's case or anybody else who might take a case, even if it's unsuccessful at this point, there is still another avenue open to us. And that is, so under the EU Migration Pact, there are 5 regulations. There's the Eurodac regulation, the screening regulation, the asylum procedure regulation, the migration management regulation, and the crisis enforcement Euro regulation. So there are 5 regulations just within the Pact. And just to say, just within those 5 regulations, there's 719 pages of legal text within those 5 regulations. And as I understand it, the Dáil maybe had less than 15 hours to debate that. So that's in itself just outrageous. But in addition to those 5 regulations, there are maybe another 5 directives that are also being introduced as part of that EU Migration Pact. So there are 10 pieces of law
So they all have to come back through the Dáil then, do they?
No, no. But what Helen McEntee did say is that they're going to have to repeal the International Protection Act and introduce alternative laws in order to bring forward the mechanisms set out within the EU Migration Pact. So whatever laws they bring forward will have to go through the normal legislative process. So it'll have to go through the 5 stages in the Seanad, the 5 stages in the Dáil, then be signed off by the President. So what that means, and first of all, Helen McEntee said that's possibly not even going to start until November of this year. And obviously, if we have a general election before that, the makeup of the Dáil could be significantly different depending on how people vote. So there's a possibility that those laws would not be passed in the Dáil. There's a possibility they would not be passed in the Seanad. And there's also a possibility they would not be signed off by the President.
That's very, very interesting. I just want just to take a breath on that for a second, so that I'm summarising it, and correct me if I get it wrong. Therefore, even if it is notified to the EU Parliament successfully, and it isn't, and there's not enough dirt in the engine and the action underway in the High Court, it then comes back through the actual Dáil again, but this time in the form of legislation that would have to go through these phases, and the President would sign it to actually put the engine, the legal engine together to support it. So let's say we just didn't do that. Where would that then leave us with regards to the EU? We're saying we're opting into something, but by the way, we're now kind of not opting into it because we're not putting the legislative engine behind it.
Mm-hmm. So there are 2 ways that laws can be passed within the European Union. There are regulations and there are directives. So the EU Migration Pact has been passed by means of 5 number regulations. Regulations are normally directly effective. So that means that you don't normally have to introduce domestic laws in order to enact the mechanism set out within the regulations. These regulations seem to be different. These regulations are saying that you do have to enact laws. But what the regulation itself says is that each individual member state has 2 years to introduce their own laws to introduce the mechanisms under the EU Migration Pact into their national systems. So if we did nothing, what it would potentially mean is that after 2 years, the EU would be writing to us and they would be saying, you're now in breach of the EU Migration Pact, you've signed up to it, and they'd probably start fining us like they've done with the likes of Hungary and that. But it all comes down to the appetite then of the government to just say, fair enough, the fines are there, we'll accept the fines or we won't pay the fines. But it all comes down to who the government is at the time.
But doesn't it also come down, this is this is fascinating. I'm sure people listening will find it as well. But if we then swing away from Ireland for a second and we look what happened in Europe after the EU the elections, we clearly see, in France especially, a huge swing towards Le Pen's party, the National Rally, and we've already seen it in Italy, and another huge swing going on in Germany, from the centre to the right, with people that think along the lines that we might think along, and that's going to change the dynamics itself.
And you know something? That's why the vote in the European Parliament was so significant. I believe the vote happened on the 10th of April of this year. I believe they had to ensure that the vote in the European Parliament to pass the EU Migration Pact happened before the European elections took place, because they knew, everybody could see things were moving a little bit further right because things had gone so insane left. So they may not even have gotten that pact across the line if the pact vote had been held after the European elections.
But the senior politicians now that are coming to the fore, like I think his name is Bardello, Jordan Bardello, this young man that's going to be the president of potentially the president, in a few days' time, because the election, I think the election process in France is going to be over around the 3rd or 4th of July. So we could be back again talking about all of this because, the mathematics, the calculus of power is going to change within the EU itself, because these are politicians that have very, very strong views on these undocumented immigrants coming into countries, without paperwork, and claiming to be refugees when, a lot of them seem to be economic migrants.
But at the same time, that gentleman that you were just talking about there, what country is he representing?
France.
France. So if you're talking about the likes of France or the likes of Italy, so obviously all of the countries now have signed up to the EU Migration Pact, with potentially the exception maybe of Denmark, and obviously we need to formally opt in. But we also know that there are certain countries that are more significantly affected by migration. So you might have the likes of maybe Italy, Greece, France, Germany. And the problem with the EU Migration Pact is that under one of the regulations, the Asylum Migration Management Regulation, it introduces what they refer to as solidarity mechanisms. So what that says is that every EU member state that signed up to the pact would have to accept relocation of a certain quota of asylum seekers or pay a financial penalty. So my concern would be that the likes of those people who don't necessarily want undocumented male migrants coming into their country might say, well, under the EU Migration Pact, I can offload some of those migrants into other countries, or I can take money through the Solidarity Fund, which is €20,000 per person in lieu of accepting relocation of a certain number of asylum seekers. So even though we might look at them and we might say, well, they're not going to be in favour of this, they might actually say that at the end of the day, signing up to it benefits their country because it's going to be sharing the responsibility out between other member states. So I'm not sure that I would hang my hat on the fact simply for that reason.
But what it will mean, I presume, is that if the balance of power is now shifting to the right in Europe, and migration is going to become a much hotter issue than it has been in the past, notwithstanding the fact that the pact has gone through, then it is not outside of the wit of the new politicians coming in to introduce further legislation in the EU, which could potentially have an impact on this problem, because
Absolutely.
we're very vulnerable here, as you can clearly see. I think maybe that's what you're alluding to, that Ireland could be forced to take even a greater quantity than 600 a week in order to facilitate other countries that have decided to buy their way out.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, all told then, Tracey, because you know you've been through the wars. I've watched you from close up and from a distance over the last few years, and you've put in a mighty stint. And I know you're across an awful lot of these issues. So, how do you? Where's your sense of what you see for Ireland towards the end of this decade? I mean, how do you see all this playing out? Past the general election. I mean, just where are we going here?
I think it all depends what happens with this general election. I think it all depends on who the people vote into power. I think if you even look at the likes of the Green Party and the likes of Pauline O'Reilly, who stood in the Shannon chamber maybe 12 months ago and said that the role of government, the role of TDs, is to restrict freedom. So I think if we're continue to elect TDs and senators into positions of power who believe that their sole responsibility is to restrict the freedom of the people that they're elected to govern, we're going nowhere. So unless we actually elect people into the Dáil and into the Seanad, obviously I know people in the Seanad are selected rather than elected, but unless we elect TDs who believe in freedom, who believe in true freedom, we're going nowhere, and we're going towards potentially Agenda 2030, which is, you know, an agenda to have as much control as possible over as much of the world as possible.
Yeah, so this is the 21st century totalitarianism.
Yes.
That's been long planned.
Yes.
Well, we'll see how it plays out, because I'm going to leave it there with Tracey. We'll see how it all plays out, because the world seems to be going into maybe a bipolar or tripolar blocks in the years to come, which you can see formulating around China, Washington, and don't be surprised if we end up with an option to move into a Eurasian economic bloc over the years ahead. It's certainly fascinating. It's deeply worrying. I was bitterly disappointed myself with the performance of the whip system in this momentous decision which was taken during the week, and I was particularly disappointed but not surprised that there hasn't been an inch of coverage about it in the media that you go out and buy, your Irish Independent, your Irish Examiner, and of course the Irish Times and RTE and News Talk and the rest of them. It really is bitterly disappointing that the voice of the people, which was clearly evident from the 18 independent TDs that voted, clearly evident on the ground if you were going around as well, has been ignored. I think there's going to be a price to pay for that at the next general election. At least I hope so. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you so much, Tracey, for explaining that in great detail and very interesting insights into where we are. And I certainly hope that it has cleared up a lot of the confusion around where we are now and where we could go next. Thank you very much for listening.